Can you believe it? Can you believe it? Again, just the exact opposite of what I ever expected to see in my lifetime. In my lifetime. I never expected them to talk about shunning and even describe in Parliament Jehovah's Witnesses as a cult. Guys, just think about this for a moment. We have an MP who is an ex-Jehovah's Witness who cares about protecting children. Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to the Attic. I'm making this video because we need to talk about something very exciting that happened last week in the House of Commons. I learned about this on Twitter. It was actually JW Leaks that tweeted video footage of an exchange between two members of Parliament, two MPs, and on further investigation it turns out that this was part of a debate on the Crime and Policing Bill. This took place on Tuesday the 17th of June 2025. So we can all picture in our minds the House of Commons, the famous chamber where political issues are dealt with in the UK. A key part of the legislative process is getting bills agreed upon in the House of Commons before they can go further down the process and become law. And part of that process involves debating. Now, many of you will know that a few years back, 2019, 2020, I was part of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, or ICSA. I was a core participant. And I was extremely frustrated in the way the inquiry, in my view, ignored large amounts of evidence that were given by former Jehovah's Witnesses regarding the abuses within the cult, specifically the cover-up of child sexual abuse and the matter of shunning. And this, as an activist, leaves me feeling like there's no hope. Like, if even a government investigation won't listen to ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, a job that they're being paid to do by the taxpayer, then what hope can there possibly be that members of Parliament who are responsible for coming up with new legislation can tighten the screws on cults and make sure that they are less able to inflict harm on people's lives? Then this happens, this exchange that I'm about to show you. So we're about to see Sam Carling, who is Labour MP for North West Cambridgeshire, and he stands up in the House of Commons to talk about the Crime and Policing Bill, specifically as it pertains to mandatory reporting, which currently we don't have in England, Wales, Scotland. And this is a huge problem, a huge loophole that the organisation can use in the UK to keep child abuse covered up. Anyway, I've spoken enough. Let's listen to what Sam Carling has to say.
Sam Carling.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I begin by again welcoming this bill. It will deliver so much for my constituents in relation to protecting people from crime and enabling tough action on antisocial behaviour, including areas which have for too long been labelled low level and ignored, like the illegal and off-road bikes, which my constituents so often raise with me. And it will introduce mandatory reporting for child sexual abuse, one of the key recommendations from the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, which I'll abbreviate as ICSA for the remainder of this speech. That is a long overdue measure and one long called for by our Labour Home Secretary and the Prime Minister personally. However, I remain concerned that the government is not going far enough on the issue of mandatory reporting, and that is why I have laid 3 amendments to the bill on that subject, numbered 10, 11 and 22, which my speech today will focus on. These are not intended to change government policy, quite the opposite. These amendments are intended to deliver the government's stated policy, to implement the ICSA recommendations relevant to the Home Office in full. The Home Secretary stated in January that this was the government's intention. And she reaffirmed that just yesterday, actually, in response to my question on her statement, with a firm yes, after I asked if it remained her policy to implement them in full. But there are three significant gaps in our plans to implement Recommendation 13 on mandatory reporting, where the bill is not delivering what ICSA recommended. With these gaps, I am concerned that the duty to report will be ineffective in some of the settings where it is most needed, religious groups in particular, and I will use the example of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the religious group which I grew up in, to illustrate how and why. They have a deep cultural distrust of secular authorities, and that leads to a culture of dealing with everything internally, as happens in a lot of different religious groups, including child sexual abuse, and reporting nothing to the police. Furthermore, their internal processes for doing so are atrocious. For example, there's something called the two-witness rule, which means they take no action on any report of wrongdoing unless there are two witnesses to it. There are never two witnesses to child sexual abuse. I give this context to highlight why the mandatory duty to report must be absolutely watertight, as ICSA recommended, to prevent people in leadership organisations, or in leadership of organisations like this, from avoiding it.
Wow. Wow. I never expected that to happen in my lifetime, for someone to stand up in the House of Commons and tell it like it is about Jehovah's Witnesses in particular. And who knew that there is now an elected representative, an MP in the House of Commons, who is an ex-Jehovah's Witness? Sam Carling for Labour, who is speaking there not just about the need for mandatory reporting, as was recommended by ICSA, but specifically why there are loopholes in the current legislation that's being considered, through which, even if they brought in mandatory reporting, through which Jehovah's Witnesses could continue to do what they're doing in terms of covering up abuse. And he names Jehovah's Witnesses. He talks about the fact that he's a former Jehovah's Witness, so he has knowledge of it. He talks about the two-witness rule, and he describes the handling of child sexual abuse among Jehovah's Witnesses as atrocious. That's just incredible to see. And again, I never thought in my lifetime that I would see words like this being spoken in the House of Commons. This is a huge deal, especially if you're British, but I can imagine no matter what country you come from, you understand the significance of this. Of a country like the UK having the potential at the level of lawmaking to understand the threat posed by cults, specifically to children. But there's more, as you will see.
The second gap relates to who actually comes under the duty to report. ICSA recommended that it should apply to anyone working, firstly, in regulated activities with children under the Safeguarding and Vulnerable Groups Act 2006. The bill uses that criterion tick. But ICSA then also recommends that it should apply to anyone in a position of trust over a child as defined by the Sexual Offences Act 2003. And that's what the bill does not include. My Amendment 22 would make it so. At the moment, the bill instead creates a list of relevant activities in Part 2 of Schedule 8, which replicates about 90% of what is in the Sexual Offences Act. But that missing 10% is critical. It includes sports coaches and teachers, for a start, which our schedule does not. And to go back to my example, the Sexual Offences Act includes a very effective definition of religious leaders in Section 22A. We have put a definition of religious leaders into our schedule in this bill, but it requires them to have, and I quote, regular unsupervised contact with children to be subject to the duty. That will allow virtually any religious leader, be they paid clergy or a volunteer elder, like in the Jehovah's Witnesses, to escape the duty, as very few have regular unsupervised contact with children, despite being in a very significant position of power and influence. And I personally happen to know at least one person who actually was sexually abused as a child in that organisation. They went to speak to religious elders about it in the presence of their parents, and not unsupervised, and they were advised that to go to the police would mean bringing reproach on God's name. So no report was made, either by the victim, their family, or those religious elders. This is commonplace. And under the bill as currently drafted, there's no sanction for that. The elders aren't mandated reporters, and even if they were, the proposed offence under clause 73 around stopping someone else from making a report, which I very much welcome for the record, only applies to other mandated reporters. So if someone pressures a victim, or their parents for example, not to make a report, that won't be illegal.
Incredible. I am so impressed with this man. So Sam Carling, having brought up Jehovah's Witnesses and their, quote, atrocious policies regarding child sexual abuse, is here laying bare one of the main loopholes in the proposed legislation in the Crime and Policing Bill that will allow the organisation to continue business as usual, and it pertains to the issue of positions of trust. Who is or isn't in a position of trust? And he's pointing out that under the proposed legislation, elders would basically get off scot-free because they're not considered to be in regular unsupervised, well, they're not typically in regular unsupervised contact with children, even though they do have enormous influence within the Jehovah's Witness community. And this influence, this power, can be used and has been used to keep child abuse quiet. And he even comes up with an example from his own personal experience, someone that he knows where this has been the case. And he says it's commonplace. Again, I'm speechless. Never did I expect this sort of talk, this sort of pragmatism and this honesty about Jehovah's Witnesses in the House of Commons. But there's more.
So that offence needs to be broadened too, and I know the NSPCC are calling for the government to consider a broader offence of concealing child sexual abuse, which I urge the government to give serious consideration to, and I may give some more detail on that later if there's time.
Will you give way?
I will give way.
Cameron Thomas.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. He's making very important points about, particularly about the Jehovah's Witness cult. And one of the methods that they use to ensure that issues like this don't escape from the organisation itself is the act of disfellowship, where an individual is threatened by being disfellowshipped all communication with their own family. And I wonder if he'll go a little further into recognising that too. Thank you.
Sam Carling.
I absolutely will, and I very much thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. I'm very pleased that other Honourable Members in the House are aware of that issue. It's something I am trying to do some work on separately. I think it is certainly relevant to what I'm discussing here. Just to give the House a little more context on that, what that essentially means is if that organisation decides that someone has committed a serious sin, it can essentially tell all of their family and friends to cut them off permanently. The same applies if they just choose to leave the religion. But very rarely is that applied to perpetrators of crimes, and more often to victims that report them. And it is an enormous problem that has to be dealt with, and I look forward to engaging with the Honourable Member further on that.
Can you believe it? Can you believe it? Again, just the exact opposite of what I ever expected to see in my lifetime. In my lifetime, I never expected them to talk about shunning and even describe in Parliament Jehovah's Witnesses as a cult. So the intervention there was Cameron Thomas, who is a Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for Tewkesbury. So just to explain, Sam Carling is in the ruling Labour Party. He's not part of the government. He's what you might call a backbencher, as far as I can tell, because what he's proposing here are amendments to the government's bill. In other words, he's not the one writing the legislation. He, as a Labour MP, is almost criticising his own party, but doing so in a very, very respectful, logical way, and saying we can go further, we can make our bill even more robust and cover up all of the loopholes. So Sam Carling is in the ruling Labour Party, and Cameron Thomas is one of the opposition. So normally if you think about the House of Commons, you think about MPs kind of slagging each other off and making barbed comments and criticising each other. But what you have here is someone on the Labour side receiving a comment from someone on the opposition side, the Liberal Democrats, and they're in total agreement. They're like, yeah, that's a great point. I'm really, really glad you've said that. And I'm really, really glad that you understand the gravity of this situation as well. It was a fascinating exchange, and I would love to know, I would love to be a fly on the wall, because I'm sure there would have been follow-up conversations between Cameron Thomas and Sam Carling after this, like, how did you know about the disfellowshipping or now removal? Suffice to say, this is incredibly bold language to be using about Jehovah's Witnesses. Even I try to avoid using the word cult as much as possible, because I realize it's an extremely polarizing word that makes it harder for me to reach out to Jehovah's Witnesses. If they feel like they're being insulted, if you are using pejorative words when you're describing their belief system, it tends to make them shut down. And you could argue the same is true with people who are neutral on the issue. The minute you start introducing pejorative terms, it kind of makes it a little bit harder to make headway, because it makes it sound like you're biased. But let's just be honest. I mean, Cameron Thomas is right. It is a cult. And disfellowshipping, or removal as it's now called, is a huge problem. And as Sam Carling indicated there, albeit briefly, it is an issue that directly impacts on child sexual abuse. I am convinced that if not for something called parliamentary privilege, both Sam Carling and Cameron Thomas would be sued by the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, or by some organisation, part of the Jehovah's Witness organisation, for their comments here. Because Sam Carling has described the child sexual abuse policy as atrocious, and made a number of other very damning comments already about child sexual abuse and the way it's dealt with by Jehovah's Witnesses. And Cameron Thomas, in just a few words, has flat out called Jehovah's Witnesses a cult. The beauty of it is that because of where they are, because they are elected members of Parliament in the House of Commons, there is nothing Jehovah's Witnesses can do about it, because they have parliamentary privilege. Jehovah's Witnesses can't do anything. This is now something that is on record. I'm actually going to leave a PDF in the description below so that you can read the full exchange, because I'm just showing you clips. The whole thing lasted about 13 or 14 minutes, and I'm just showing you kind of the most relevant parts. But this is a very, very damning speech and intervention to that speech that is on record as having taken place on Tuesday, the 17th of June, 2025, in the House of Commons. And there's more.
So, the Australian Royal Commission, which investigated this organisation's handling of abuse cases, as I highlighted at second reading, found that allegations had been documented by religious elders against 1,006 individuals in Australia alone, and not a single one was reported to police. So we must tighten up this definition and make sure it includes religious leaders. The government could do that by amending our definition in item 17 of part 2 of schedule 4, and also adding a further item to the list in relation to sports professionals to deal with that point as well, But the much neater and stronger legislative solution would be to just do what ICSA said and refer to the Sexual Offences Act 2003 and the definition therein. And as I said, my Amendment 22 proposes to do this.
So he even talks about the Australian Royal Commission. Incredible. The 1006 figure, that damning figure that came out of the Australian Royal Commission, 1006 cases of child sexual abuse going all the way back to 1950, and not a single one of them reported to authorities. And now that's been said in the House of Commons by an MP who cares. Guys, just think about this for a moment. We have an MP who is an ex-Jehovah's Witness who cares about protecting children. I mean, it's not like a blowing up the Death Star moment by a long stretch. It's not like the battle is won by any stretch. But I've long argued that we are just at the wrong point in history when it comes to the way governments approach cults and their total naivety when it comes to the abuse of cults and how they ruin lives. And one of the main reasons why we are so behind is that, number one, the media doesn't take this matter seriously. And if the media doesn't take it seriously, I mean, you do get the occasional exposing article or series, but it's typically like a flash in the pan. Without the media taking it seriously, how is the population going to take it seriously, and how are lawmakers going to take it seriously? Well, it turns out all you need is to wait for someone to be elected into the House of Commons who actually knows firsthand what this is all about. And not only does Sam Carling know about this, he's doing something about it. He's standing there, having clearly done his homework and speaking with such eloquence and such grace and such precision about what Jehovah's Witnesses are doing and how they're covering up abuse and what the government needs to do to make it illegal. So I am so excited about this. Needless to say, I've reached out to both Sam Carling and Cameron Thomas by email, but I won't be making any ensuing correspondence public unless, of course, it's by arrangement with those individuals. But I'm very, very excited by this development. Something, I never, ever expected to happen. I'd be interested to know your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you found this video interesting, and as always, thank you for watching.